The boy's knees were shaking so hard the chains on his boots rattled. Morning frost clung to his hair, turning the blonde curls into thin, shimmering ice. He couldn't lift his eyes, not with the American guard staring at him like that. The camp gate groaned open. Every German prisoner froze, because on the other side of the wire stood an American soldier kneeling in the snow, holding something none of them expected, a steaming metal mug. The young POW swallowed hard. He thought this was the moment he had dreaded since capture. He whispered, barely able to breathe, "Will I be shot?" The soldier looked at him, confused, almost hurt, and the answer he gave was the first thing in months that made the boy's eyes fill with tears. But he didn't know the truth yet. The frost had a way of swallowing sound, softening everything except the beating of a terrified young soldier's heart. It was the winter of 1944, the kind of winter that didn't care who it killed, American, German, civilian, soldier. Snowflakes drifted like ashes from a dying fire as a line of exhausted German prisoners stumbled toward the American camp, their breath sharp in the frozen air. And somewhere in that line, shoulders hunched, boots cracking apart at the seams, marched a 17-year-old boy who no longer had the strength to pretend he was a man. He had been on the run for days. Hunger gnawed at his ribs, sleep had become a memory, and every sound, the distant thud of artillery, the crack of a rifle, even the snapping of branches, made him flinch. He had lost 2 friends on the road, boys no older than him, but there had been no time to mourn. Retreat didn't allow mourning. Retreat only allowed fear. The American camp rose out of the fog like a ghostly shape. Wooden posts, barbed wire, guard towers standing rigid in the snow. Everything looked sharp, cold, unwelcoming. The boy's heart hammered harder. He remembered every story he had been told, stories whispered by officers with steel in their voices. The Americans don't take prisoners. They torture, they shoot, they make you disappear. He remembered the propaganda posters warning them of cruel enemies who laughed at suffering. And he believed every word. Why wouldn't he? He had never seen an American before. He had only seen the fear etched on the faces of men older than him. But now, as he was marched through the outer gate, reality pressed down on him like a weight he could barely carry. He wasn't sure what frightened him more, the possibility of death or the fact that he had no idea what would come next. Boots crunched in the snow. The smell of smoke from an American cook fire drifted toward the prisoners. They weren't sure if it was food or burning wood, and hunger made every prisoner's eyes follow the rising steam automatically. The boy stumbled for a moment, his knees buckling, but he caught himself and kept moving. He didn't want to draw attention. Drawing attention meant punishment. He had learned that from his own officers long before he ever saw an enemy. But as he stepped into the camp's clearing, something inside him cracked. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was months of fear crystallizing into a single moment he couldn't control anymore. He opened his mouth, intending to ask for water or a blanket or anything that sounded like survival. But instead, with his voice barely more than a trembling breath, he said the question that had lived in his chest for weeks. "Will I be shot?" The words froze in the air, more fragile than the snowflakes falling around him. And in that instant, before any answer came, every prisoner, every guard, every sound in the camp seemed to stop. Because the boy wasn't truly asking about bullets. He was asking if his life, after everything, still had a chance. Ladies and gentlemen, history is filled with gunfire, strategy, and maps. But sometimes the most powerful stories are whispered. Our story begins on a frozen morning in the winter of 1944. The war was collapsing on the Western Front. The German army, once roaring with confidence, had crumbled into scattered, starving soldiers. Among them walked boys who had never wanted to fight, yet found themselves trapped in a machine far bigger than they were. One of those boys was 17 years old. He had marched for 3 days with no food. His boots were falling apart, and in his eyes lived the same fear carried by thousands of young German soldiers. A fear carefully planted by the Reich itself. They had been told that the Americans were butchers, that surrender meant torture, that captivity meant death. And so, on that cold morning, when he was captured with a group of surviving soldiers, the boy's terror was not imaginary. It was the result of years of indoctrination, years of voices telling him that mercy did not exist on the other side of the front line. When the trucks bringing the prisoners arrived at the American camp, the gate groaned open like a beast waking. Prisoners lined up, silent, trembling, waiting for the verdict of their fate. And then, something happened. The young German boy broke ranks. His breath came in sharp, trembling bursts. He stepped forward, eyes lowered, voice barely audible. He whispered to the American standing guard, "Will I be shot?" The American froze. He looked at the boy, thin, exhausted, wearing a uniform far too big for him. And in that moment, the guard understood. He understood the fear, the propaganda, the lies that had poisoned the minds of young soldiers. So the American did something unexpected. He didn't shout. He didn't laugh. He didn't push the boy back in a line. He kneeled down in the snow. He met the boy's eyes and said, "Son, you're safe now. No one here is going to harm you." The boy's face crumbled. For the first time in months, tears, hot, uncontrollable, ran down his frozen cheeks. To him, this wasn't just mercy. It was a contradiction to everything he had been taught. It was the first moment he realized that the enemy was human. You see, history often forgets this side of war. We talk about battles, victories, defeats, but we rarely speak of the moments in between, the moments when humanity rises from rubble. In American-run POW camps, German prisoners found something they did not expect. They found food, simple but enough to live. They found medical tents staffed by men who treated even those who had marched under the Nazi flag. They found guards who followed the Geneva Convention not out of fear, but because they believed in it. Many POWs later said the same thing. They were treated with more respect by their American captors than they had been by their own officers. And the boy, the one who had whispered, "Will I be shot?" He felt this truth every day. He remembered the first hot meal he received, thick soup and bread. He remembered an American medic wrapping his frostbitten fingers. He remembered the guard who taught him how to say thank you in English. Slowly, the shadows in his mind began to lift. One evening, months later, he confessed to another prisoner, "I don't know how to hate them anymore." And that, my friends, is the real power of humanity. It doesn't erase the horrors of war. It doesn't fix the past, but it can change a mind. It can heal a heart. It can turn an enemy into a human being again. Years after the war ended, that young boy, now a grown man, told his story in an interview. His voice trembled as he remembered the moment he thought he would die, and the moment his captor told him he would live. He said, "War took away everything I had, but that American soldier gave me back my hope." And that is why this story matters. Because in the darkest moments of history, when nations clash and hatred burns, there are still people, ordinary soldiers, who choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over revenge, humanity over destruction. And sometimes, a single sentence whispered across the snow can change the course of life. A young German POW whispered, "Will I be shot?" And the American's answer made him cry. May we remember what that answer meant. May we carry its lesson into every conflict, every division, every wound in our world today. War dehumanizes, but kindness restores what war tries to erase. Thank you. He had been trained to obey without question, to follow orders without hesitation, to fear the enemy above all else. Yet, in the quiet moments before capture, he realized that the enemy wasn't just a face across a battlefield. It was a symbol, a name, a rumor amplified into terror. The Reich had fed him stories since childhood. Americans were cruel. Americans were merciless. Americans were monsters who would take your life without thought or pity. Every leaf of propaganda, every whispered warning from older soldiers, had worked like a hammer against his mind, shaping it into something rigid, fearful, and obedient. Now, standing in the snow, he could feel the weight of all those stories pressing down on him. He tried to measure the space between himself and the American guard, imagining the bullet that might already be aimed in his direction. Every instinct screamed, run, hide, pray, but there was nowhere to go. No allies, no escape. He was a boy alone in the teeth of a war that had grown far bigger than him. And yet, in that same moment, a flicker of disbelief surged. The American in front of him was not shouting. He was not smiling cruelly. He wasn't pointing a rifle with a steady aim. He was watching without hatred, without contempt, and that alone was confusing. His mind struggled to reconcile what it had been taught with what it was seeing. How could this man be human, and yet so unlike the monsters described in the stories? The young German soldier thought of his home, the small town he had left behind, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the laughter of his younger sister by the window. And suddenly, the contrast hit him like a punch. The world he remembered, the warmth and innocence, had been replaced with a frozen field of fear. Yet here was a man who carried neither malice nor cruelty. His body trembled with more than just cold. His knees shook with a combination of exhaustion and disbelief. The fear drilled deep into his chest, but it was now laced with something else: confusion, the sharp, aching pain of not knowing what was real. Every step he had taken in retreat, every friend lost, every order followed without question, led to this moment. And still, he didn't understand it. This confusion made the young boy speak. He whispered again, the words breaking against his lips like ice. "Will I be shot?" Not only a question about survival, but a question about the world he thought he knew. And in that whisper, there was the weight of years of lies and the raw, desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the truth was different. The American's gaze did not falter. It did not judge. It did not dismiss. And for a soldier trained to expect hate and violence at every encounter, that pause, the absence of cruelty, was more disarming than any weapon. Fear had dominated him for weeks. Yet now it collided with a fragile spark of curiosity. Could this really be kindness, even in the middle of war? The boy did not know, and that uncertainty made the snow feel colder, the silence heavier, and the moment itself impossibly alive. The line of prisoners shuffled forward, the snow crunching beneath their boots like brittle bones. Every breath was visible in the frigid air, curling and fading like smoke, and the boy could feel the cold biting through his uniform. His stomach ached from hunger, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing terror in his chest. He had never faced death so directly, so suddenly, so intimately. All around him, older soldiers walked with stiff faces pretending calm, but he could hear it in their breaths, the same silent panic he felt. He had been trained to obey, to follow orders, to suppress fear. But that training had not prepared him for the unanticipated, for the question that burned hotter than fire. What if he truly would be shot? What if everything he had been told about the Americans was true? He dared not look at the soldiers beside him, fearing to see their final despair mirrored in his own eyes. The stories of brutality, the warnings of execution, had grown like a shadow over him, darker than the winter sky above. He stumbled slightly, and the cold wind bit at his cheeks, sharp and unforgiving, making his eyes water. The voices in his mind, memories of propaganda, memories of fallen comrades, memories of his own mistakes, clashed with the faint, inexplicable calm in the American guard's posture. Something inside him wanted to lash out, to strike at the fear, to convince himself it was all a lie. But his voice, fragile and trembling, betrayed him. "Well, will I be shot?" he whispered again, this time louder, almost hoping for the answer, almost fearing it. The words hovered in the icy air like a fragile bird, ready to shatter at any moment. It was not a demand, nor a plea. It was a raw confession of all the terror he had carried. Months of retreat, starvation, and exposure had condensed into a single human question, one that carried the weight of a boy's entire existence. The American guard, tall, calm, and seemingly indifferent to the harsh cold, looked down at him. His eyes did not hold judgment, did not hold contempt, did not hold the cruelty the boy had imagined. They were steady, measured, human. The young POW felt the strangest sensation, suspicion mixed with longing, a delicate balance of fear and hope. His mind struggled to reconcile the man before him with everything he had been told. How could someone who had the power to harm him choose not to? How could kindness exist in the middle of this brutal, endless war? The boy's knees wobbled, and he could barely keep his weight on his feet. He wanted to hate, to reject, to harden himself. But the warmth in the guard's gaze was undeniable, subtle, and terrifying. If this was kindness, why did it hurt so much? He did not know. And yet, in the uncertainty, a small ember of understanding flickered, fragile but persistent. It whispered that maybe survival was not just a matter of luck or strategy, but of something far deeper, humanity itself. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to imagine a world beyond fear. He imagined standing, unshaken, under the same sky, unafraid to breathe, unafraid to live. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, the war seemed less like a machine built to destroy him, and more like a backdrop to a singular, impossible choice: to meet cruelty with mercy and to find trust in the least expected place. The American soldier had been standing at his post for hours, the cold gnawing through his coat, boots frozen stiff against the snow-covered ground. He had seen hundreds of prisoners before: teenagers, men broken by war, families displaced, exhausted soldiers whose fear was as raw as the boys in front of him. And yet, when the young German whispered those words, "Well, will I be shot?" something inside the guard shifted. It was not just a routine question. It was a soul laid bare, trembling, vulnerable, and desperate. He knelt slowly in the snow, letting his knees sink into the cold, his breath forming clouds that disappeared almost instantly. He wanted the boy to see that he was not a monster, that he was not a weapon aimed at the heart of someone too young to comprehend the full horror of war. He wanted the boy to understand, in the simplest terms, that not every enemy was cruel, that not every soldier was a tool of death. The American's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but deliberate. It carried the authority of someone who had seen enough death to know when mercy mattered more than power. "You're safe," he said, and paused to let the words sink in. "No one here is going to harm you. Not now. Not ever." The boy's lips trembled. He wanted to believe, but every fiber of his being had been trained to distrust. He swallowed hard, trying to force down the emotion that surged in his chest. The emotion that wasn't fear, but something far more confusing: relief, wonder, disbelief. His knees gave way slightly, and the American reached out, steadying him, guiding him to stand upright. There was no mockery in his actions, no hint of condescension, only a quiet humanity that the boy had never expected. All around, the other prisoners watched silently, many too broken to even register what was happening. But for the boy, time seemed to stretch, elongating the seconds into eternity. Every detail became etched in memory: the snow crunching softly underfoot, the bitter cold seeping into his bones, the faint smell of burning wood from the campfires, the way the American's eyes did not waver. And then, impossibly, he began to cry. Hot tears ran down frozen cheeks, a mixture of fear finally releasing and hope he had thought extinct. It was not shame that made him cry, nor weakness, but a profound realization that life could be spared even in the midst of destruction. That mercy could exist where he had been told only cruelty could. That even in war, humanity could pierce the armor of fear and indoctrination. The American watched quietly, giving him space, letting him feel the weight of survival without saying more than necessary. Sometimes, he thought, words are not enough. Sometimes the act itself, the kneeling, the steady gaze, the choice to protect rather than punish, spoke louder than any lecture on morality or orders. The boy's mind struggled to process it all. Could this really be kindness? Could the enemy really care? Every lie he had been told, every warning of brutality, seemed to crumble in the cold air. And yet, deep down, he felt it, a seed of trust, fragile and trembling, but alive. For the first time since the retreat began, he felt safe, not just physically but inside. Something inside him, battered and raw, began to soften. And in that instant, standing in the snow under the shadow of the camp's barbed wire, The impossible truth dawned on him. Even in war, even in fear, even in the grip of terror, some people chose humanity. The boy's mind spun as he looked around the camp. Everything felt surreal. The wire fences, the wooden barracks, the guards moving calmly among prisoners, the distant glow of cook fires against the snow. It should have felt threatening. It should have felt cruel. And yet it didn't. Not like he had been told it would. The fear that had clung to him for weeks, a constant shadow, began to tremble, almost imperceptibly, as he noticed the details that didn't make sense. In his imagination, Americans had been monsters in uniform, faces twisted with malice, voices like knives. But here, he saw men who laughed quietly among themselves, who offered bread to a trembling prisoner without hesitation, who treated frostbitten hands with care rather than punishment. He watched a guard hand a blanket to an older man whose teeth chattered violently, and the boy's chest tightened with disbelief. Could it really be this simple? That someone could care without expectation, without threat, without demand? The propaganda he had grown up with had never accounted for nuance. Everything in his education, every whispered caution from officers, every poster lining the train stations of his childhood, had painted the enemy in black and white. Americans were evil. Americans were ruthless. Americans were to be feared above all else. And yet, the small contradictions he observed, warm soup offered without insult, laughter shared across the snow, music from a harmonica drifting into the cold air, gnawed at that rigid image. He began noticing little things, details he had never imagined could exist in a war zone. A nurse kneeling beside a sick prisoner, tending him with gentle hands. A soldier pausing mid-step to offer a cigarette to a tired man. A small pile of books stacked neatly in a corner for prisoners to read. They were acts so ordinary, so human, that the boy almost didn't recognize them as acts of kindness. His mind, trained to anticipate cruelty, had no vocabulary for such gestures. He wanted to hate them. He wanted to cling to the fear that had kept him alive. But every act of human decency chipped away at his armor. Every small smile, every offered hand, every cooked meal without strings attached felt like a contradiction to everything he had been taught, and it hurt. If this was kindness, why did it feel so strange? Why did it unsettle him so profoundly? The boy could not reconcile the world he had been told existed with the reality standing before him, warm and alive in the freezing snow. Even the guard's discipline was different. There was authority, yes, but it was paired with respect. Orders were given with a measured tone, not with screaming or threats. Mistakes were corrected without humiliation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the young soldier began to understand. He was not a prisoner to hatred here. He was a human being, flawed and frightened, but still human. It was in these small, quiet contrasts, the meals, the music, the warmth, the patience, that the boy began to see the line between propaganda and truth. He realized that cruelty was not inevitable, that fear was not the only lens through which to see the world. And in that realization, a fragile seed of hope began to take root, trembling but alive. The snow fell heavier, the wind cutting sharper, yet the boy felt something he had not felt in months, a glimmer of trust. Not blind trust, not naive trust, but a tentative, trembling recognition that humanity could exist even in the heart of war. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps he could survive more than just the bullets. Perhaps he could survive the war inside himself.